and it's got a lot of good materials in it, and even the more complicated things in the book, we will try to unravel and make them interesting. And then we'll move on later to the molecular relationship book. Okay, beginning the class on white magic. Last time we left off, we talked about four basic uses of the hands. He says that, and we discussed it a little bit, and he goes into some more detail here we'll go into, but their hands are symbols of acquisitiveness, they're centers of force, they're wielders of the sword, and they are, when employed unselfishly, they can be instruments of healing and agencies whereby certain keys are turned, which was an interesting phrase. So he goes into these in some more detail. Now, first of all, he starts out with acquisitiveness. There's an acquisitiveness of the selfish person and of the servant. He says, one gathers for self and the others for service. And that's one thing that kind of is in harmony with everybody in this group, I believe, that whatever they seek to acquire in life, the disciple seeks to acquire it so he can be more useful, more of a servant to humanity. Whereas a lower evolved person, he wants to acquire talents and ability so he can have what he wants, get a better car, a better house, better status, better fame and glory and things like this. This is what the average person wants to acquire, but everybody wants to acquire, and the hands are symbols of this acquisitiveness because hands reach out and they grab stuff, so they're a symbol of this. But one thing I've noticed about people is that it's a natural human instinct to want to be useful. And that really registered with me one time when I was uh, had an advertising business, and I was going around selling advertising, and I encountered this group of handicapped people. They were led by this gal that was blind, and she had terminal cancer of the brain on top of everything else. But she led this group of severely handicapped people, and they were making toys and things to sell. And so I visited with them, and I said, "Well, don't you get any help from the government?" She's because there was a handicapped organization that got funds from the government, and she said, "No, my group is so severely handicapped, the government thinks we're beyond being useful." But she says, "This everybody here wants to do something, you know." So just for instance, one person in the group was once a healthy kid, but he fell off this cliff when he's climbing a mountain or something, and he was a paraplegic, and all he could move was a couple of fingers on his right hand. And he had this board. This was before computers. He had this board with the alphabet on, and when you talked to him, he spelled out the letters to reply. And I was amazed that this kid still wanted to be useful. He wanted to be able to do something, and he could just move his right hand was about all he could do. And that really drilled into me when I visited the people in this group, and I was so touched that I organized a fundraiser for him and helped them raise some money because they were really desperate to fund it because they couldn't get any help from the government because, like I say, the government, the authorities thought they were beyond being useful. But these guys, everybody in the group was severely handicapped, but they really wanted to be useful. And it just drilled into me that idea that each individual wants to be of use to something, of service. But unfortunately, the lower evolved people want to be service for self, and they're motivated in that direction. And then when all their energies are towards self, they feel unfulfilled at the end. It's just the the fulfillment they're looking for never comes. And eventually that frustration becomes so great that they are faced with two paths, either the path of pure selfishness or the path of service. And eventually most of us pick service. And when we pick service, then when your usefulness is towards something that is greater than just self, then the fulfillment becomes much greater, and the motivation becomes greater, and the dedication becomes greater, and the disciple reaches a point to where he just doesn't ever give up. Whereas the person on the lower path gets frustrated easy, gives up, switches to something else. The person on the higher path just doesn't give up. Now, Curtis, you've been pretty persistent over the years, ever since you got a little enlightenment. You just don't give up, do you?
I can't even spell those words. Uh, well, you know, I got a lot of inspiration along the way from lots of different sources. But I remember Winston Churchill gave a speech to a class, a university class, and this was right after World War II. And he got up in front of this huge class and he said these words. He said, "Never give up, never give up, never, never, ever give up."
Yeah.
And he sat down, and that was his speech.
Yeah, I remember that. That was interesting phraseology he used. I really love that guy.
Yeah, he was a really cool guy. He'd walk into a room full of soldiers, and they would shrink and cower and think, oh, here's the boss. We better watch out. And he'd say, "Hey, you guys got enough beer?"
Yeah, yeah, I
Hey,
like that too. I
"You got enough
remember reading
beer,
that.
whatever they want."
Yeah,
So he's a guy that never gave up, and that he was an inspiration.
he was exactly what England needed to defeat Hitler at the time.
Yeah, he's a great guy.
How about you, Ed? Do you ever give up?
I never give up.
Now, how old are you again? I keep forgetting. You're about somewhere around 80, I remember.
On February 24th, I'll be 82.
82, yeah,
But
okay. Well,
I'm really ageless.
so you've hung in there over the years trying to accomplish as much enlightenment as possible, right? And do you think of yourself or do you think of others? What do you think about when you try to move forward with your evolution?
You're muted, Ed.
Oh,
I tried to increase my ability to become more useful to the group. And when I think of the group, I don't think of just this group, but I think of the group of evolved souls with whom I have been seeking all through my life. And
yeah,
I've contacted many groups. I've participated with many groups, and I want to be a synthesizer where we can all join our efforts and not have separate efforts.
yeah. Okay. Well, that's unfortunately, we have to be separate to some degree, but in our thoughts, we can link up to other groups. And this is one thing that DK emphasizes. He talks about the group that's in touch with the masters through mental telepathy. He calls them the new group of world servers. And if you're a member of the new group of world servers, once you know, you're not going to necessarily see master appear in your bedroom, but you'll feel inspiration coming, and this inspiration links you up with everybody else. And I write about this. I call it the oneness principle. If you if you tune in to this, to your soul, then you can link up with others that are tuned in to your soul and gather inspiration from them. And sometimes you'll get impressions that you never know where it may come from. It may come from somebody else like you, maybe in another part of the world. It may come from a master, or it may come from your own soul. But this linkage is something that DK stresses. Okay.
He says in this Labors of Hercules that as you approach the consciousness of your soul, you'll get hints, sometimes from your soul, sometimes from a master. Don't look for them to come around and give you accolades, but they'll give you a hint about your next step, and then they'll withdraw, and you have to act on it. And if you don't act on it, you don't get another hint.
Yeah, and if you act on it, you get more. If you don't act on it, then you'll be kind of hampered a little bit in getting more.
Yeah.
We've been given hints throughout the last Piscean age of what we should do, and we need to use what we've already been given. We need to seek first the kingdom of heaven, as it says, which is the kingdom of souls. And if we do that, then we can be given more.
Yeah, that's right. And we've been given quite a bit, really, if we could just act on what we have. Even this is another thing that DK points out. He says, you know, the basic things you're taught in Sunday school, like loving your neighbor and stuff like that. He says, the trouble with some of these things, he says, there are things that we need to do, but they come across so trite, like, you know, I've been there, done that, a lot of people think, and then they want to move on to something higher where they haven't really fulfilled some of the basics yet. And yeah, we always need to remind ourselves of the basics. Now he says this: the initiate holds nothing for himself. The savior of the race may utilize all that is laid up in the divine storehouse, but not for himself, only for those he seeks to help. So this is the attitude that the disciple must have, is everything you're seeking to achieve, you seek to achieve for the whole, not for the part. And as you do this, you actually, the part, which is us as individuals, will be more satisfied. As I says, if you're seeking for the lower self only, the satisfaction, the complete satisfaction will never be there. You'll get a little temporary satisfaction, but it's never complete. But when the person is totally dedicated, then there's nothing lacking. Then the fulfillment will be there once the person is totally dedicated. Now, what each disciple has to do is examine himself in his heart, because there are many people think they're totally dedicated to the whole when they still got quite a bit going on where they want to exalt the part. So this is what each disciple needs to do, is examine himself and ask that question: am I totally dedicated to the service of the whole, to a plan which is higher than myself? And so this is an important question. Okay, another question is, well, how far shall the disciple take this? Don't we have to take care of our own needs? We have to make enough to feed our families and stuff like that. So how much energy, is it all right to put energy into taking care of self then? What do you think about that? Let's ask, who haven't we picked on here? Well, Adam, what do you think about that?
I think definitely, and I think it's a struggle sometimes for people that see themselves on the path, or that want to be on that path of service, because if you focus all your energies there, then struggle. I know I've struggled in life financially, and the hardest part of that is not my own, the burden it might be on me, but the burden it is on a growing family. And so I realized, this was probably 10, 15 years ago, I had to start focusing on the business aspect of living and providing a comfortable living for my family.
Yeah, the disciple needs to realize that he's actually a part of the whole, and his needs has to be taken care of, because if your needs are not taken care of, then you can't really be of service. Now, like you, Adam, I have gone through some really dry spells in my life, and where I've had to really struggle financially. And when I've gone through those, it was most difficult to focus on anything spiritual. And but when your needs are taken care of, then it's much easier to focus on the spiritual. So it is important that the person struggles to take care of his immediate needs. But if you do it with the attitude of, when my needs are taken care of, then I can be a more useful instrument, then that's the attitude to have. But if the person is really struggling financially, I've made, apparently anyway, my least progress in life when I've really struggled financially, because it takes all your attention. You put all your attention on just surviving when you're in that type of a struggle. How about anybody else here had a big struggle financially in their lives?
Who hasn't?
Yeah, most people have. I think a lot of people can identify with that. How about you, Juan? If you had a struggle in your life one time or another?
Yeah, there was moments that was kind of like, up and down, like a roller coaster. But, from my experience, the way I understood the kind of like law of universe, even if I was having very little, I always share kind of in some degree. And then as soon as I share, my jar was filled up again. Even it was small, it was filled up. So I have kind of like some kind of understanding that whatever you have, if you share, you don't have to be worried too much, because it's going to refill the jar itself. It's like never-ending process.
That's a really good point, Juan, because I remember reading a book by Catherine Ann Ponder she's a Unity teacher. And she says, if you're really struggling and feel you don't have enough to share, she says, share. And then the bounties of the universe will start to come to you. And that's kind of what you have proven in your life. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly my point was. So I as much I can think about struggling, if I release the struggling to the universe, it's automatically everything reverse. Like, not like in the moment, but, if you just keep thinking that this is nothing, because eventually it's going to get better anyway. So that's the way it is. I think this is the first principle. You cannot really think too much about the struggling, because you're getting yourself into deeper crap than you're thinking.
This applies to other things besides finances. Let's say you're depressed. If you're depressed, well, the best thing you can do is go cheer somebody else up.
Exactly.
If you go cheer somebody else up, then all of a sudden you start feeling better. You're not depressed anymore.
Exactly. This is chain reaction. So you have to just shake it off the stressful moments, and it's just like I said, pick up the phone, call somebody, and you're going to feel better.
Right. If you're unhealthy, help somebody else maintain their health, and you'll start feeling better. I mean, it's an interesting principle that you brought up here that works in all phases of life.
That's exactly.
If you're feeling negative, help somebody else be positive. If you're feeling unhappy, do something to make somebody else happy.
Because if you think that you struggle, there is always someone who struggles more than you.
You know, I think this Christmas season is a good example of that, because parents, in some ways, enjoy Christmas more than their kids, because what tickles the parents more than seeing the kids open their presents on Christmas Day that they give to them, and they see the smiles on their faces, and this seeing these little children happy just gives the parents a high. You know, seeing any little kid open a present and just being thrilled gives you a thrill. And this is because this is the principle that as you help others, you are helped. As you give, you also receive. So yeah, that's an interesting principle. It's one that we should focus on more, because if all disciples really understood this, they would very rarely be experiencing much negativity. And
This is the same thing about, you know, keeping a smile face. It's just it's harder to keep the smile than be sad. Sad all
yeah,
the time, basically.
right.
But if you said, just keep about, you know, keep thinking about smile face, and that's going to create totally different surroundings. So it's just kind of like a good thing to have a smile all the time, you know, because this is just create, you know, all the changes around you immediately. So.
And this is the thing with group work too. One of the problems with group work is sooner or later somebody starts criticizing somebody else, and then they get criticized. So if the person is feeling like he's too much enduring too much criticism, what should he do? He should start saying nice things to other people, praising other people, and then what's going to happen eventually? People's going to start saying nice things about him or her. And so that's an interesting play on it also. So yeah, this is a great principle. We could talk about this for the whole class, because it's a very important principle. Any more comments on this before we move on here?
Yeah, you've mentioned being useful several times today, and that's when I teach my students, I tell them, if you want to know about the rules of life, I said you can boil it down to 3 important rules. Number 1 is have fun. Number 2 is to learn new things all the time. And number 3 is become a useful member of groups.
Yeah, good points.
Well, what you're talking about is increasing energy flow. And if a person is focused on self, the energy is going to come here and stop. He's only going to accumulate so much. But if you see yourself as a relay point where energy it could be in the form of knowledge, information, material things, it comes to you and you say, wow, I'm a member of the group. I'm just going to relay it. I only need so much. I have to take enough for me, but I'm going to pass the rest on. Pretty soon you've increased the flow, and you got a flood. You got a flood of knowledge or information or intuition, or it could be material things. And if you look at how can I take this and pass it on, you're going to be given a lot more than you can even imagine.
Yeah, it's like the parable of the talents. The guy that increased his talents was given more. The guy that didn't increase his talents was just worried about self. It was taken from him, even that which he had, which is seems kind of a stark thing to happen. But Jesus was just talking about kind of a natural law that, like the old saying says, if you don't use it, you lose it.
Yeah, so you just be a flow. Now, I wanted to just acknowledge what he said about hands in this labor where he captures the Cretan bull. He says he comes back and his teacher who sends him out says, you came with empty hands. And Hercules says, yeah, I have empty hands because I fulfilled the labor. So I had a couple 100 pounds of potatoes come to me, and I filled these grocery bags full of potatoes and pass them on. And when I take them out, my hands are full. And when I come back, of course, they're empty. And that's one of the principles of the laborer is if your hands are empty, what can you fill them with that you can send along or that you can pass out or that you can share? So if your hands are full, you can give. So it's a give and receive principle. The
Yeah.
more you give, the more, of course, you receive.
Yeah, this is really important principle. We could talk about this for the whole class, like I say. The next point he talks about the hands are centers of force. The hands are centers and distributors of force, and there is a real transmission of energy through the laying on of hands after he masters this acquisitiveness. So these are a little bit sequential. So once the person learns to acquire for the whole rather than the self, this causes you to have more power in your hands. So some of the people in the group have been into Reiki, and in Reiki, you put your hands on people, and that's all they do is just put their hands on people and in quiet meditation, let the energy flow. Now, the ones that are the greatest healers, according to what DK says here, are people that have learned to acquire for the whole rather than the self. Once the person has done this, then your hands actually become a center of energy, which is interesting. So it's important that we apply that first step of acquiring and becoming, seeing ourselves as servants rather than to be served. And this will amplify the power that is actually in your hands. So he says the power of laying on of hands can be studied in four aspects. One, he says, in healing. In this case, the force which flows through the hands comes from a dual source through the etheric centers, the spleen and the heart. Okay, these are two centers. Now, we all know about the heart center. That's one of the seven majors. The spleen isn't one of the seven majors, but it's a strong contender. And these two centers are important for the understanding, for the focusing of the healing energy through the hands. And the heart is the most important because DK says this about healing. He says, if you don't know anything about healing, if you don't understand all the principles, it's great if you do. But he says if you don't do anything else, just focus on sending love. Love itself is a pure healing energy, and it will always just sending, if you can't do anything else, just sending love and focus of sending love through the hands of you're actually touching the person or near the person. This that will do nothing but help. He says also working with the centers, linking the base of the spine and the throat. Okay, so the base of the spine, the throat center is the center of creativity, and you can use the hands to sense the energy of these two centers coming through the hands also. And the third, he says, in the work of linking a man up to his ego or soul. The force used here must be received from three etheric centers, the solar plexus, the heart, and the center between the eyebrows. Okay? So if you want to link up with your soul, you can visualize, you can like put your hands on your solar plexus and then raise them up to the heart and then raise it up to the center between the at the forehead, and remember there's two major petals there, and visualize one of each hand, and then you can visualize a stream of light coming out from the center, and projecting the energy wherever you want to send it. And the last, you can use the hands in group work. Here the energy is utilized by emanating from the soul itself via the head center, the throat center, and the base of the spine. The disciple must learn to use the hands to transmit the forces from the centers and then through the hands. Well, the major center to use for transmitting healing energy is the third eye, the ajna center of the forehead. But the disciple needs to just experiment using these centers. First of all, feel the energy in the centers. Like this, if you feel strongly about something, then that comes from your solar plexus. Okay, a normal desire nature, spiritual love, your heart center, desire for service to humanity, the desire to feel useful, ideas appear in the head center, in the ajna center, the third eye, and when you feel purpose, like you want to fulfill a higher will, that would come from the crown. So feel the energy of these centers, and then you can visualize the energy of the centers going through your left and right hands to where you want to direct them. So this is quite a science. He talks more about this and using these centers in esoteric healing. If you want to, learn more about the use of energies there. He says, through a knowledge of the law, a disciple can not only utilize the current flowing through the centers of his own body, but he can combine them with planetary or cosmic currents to be found in his environment. This is done unconsciously frequently by speakers, for instance, who magnetically use their hands to any extent, and the effects are seen by the clairvoyant are often amazing. When this work is done consciously, a most potent factor is added to the equipment of the disciple. This is interesting. When you watch speakers and see them move their hands, if you see a speaker just standing there stiff, just reading something, it's really boring. But when the guy gets up and he starts moving his hands around, I mean, sometimes that does add energy. And this is what he says it's interesting. He says if you're clairvoyant, you see a guy up there moving his hands around, he says you will see a whole bunch of energy and motion. And he says it's quite spectacular if you're clairvoyant enough to see it. But so that would be interesting. But yeah, like with the hands, I think of John F. Kennedy. He used his hands very effectively. When I used to watch him speak, I remember I was almost as impressed with his hand movements as I was what he was saying. I think he had a lot of energy in his hands. And other speakers are that way too.
Tony Robbins is that way.
Yeah.
Tony Robbins, you ever watch him? He not only uses his hands, he uses his whole body. He goes out and spins around and does all kinds of aerobical things. And I mean, people pay him $250,000 just to watch him perform on stage because the way he moves energy.
Yeah, he's kind of a master at that. All right, and it's amazing how much people do pay to attend his sessions. Okay.
Just one thing about Tony Robbins, he said, people think I'm in this because I'm a great guy, because I want to raise consciousness of the planet. He says, not at all. He says, I just want to make enough money to buy an island in Fiji.
Yeah, he's not into the service angle that much, but I remember what motivated him was he wanted to make a bunch of money and be totally independent. But on that level, even though he's motivated for self to a degree at least, he still wields quite a bit of energy. And this is one thing that DK points out. He says, whether it's for higher or lower, a lot of the principles we use are the same. It's just that, just a little bit like money. Money is neutral. Money can be used for really good things or really bad things. And the same thing with energy. The energy can be used for good or bad, but the disciples, all of us, need to learn to master the energy. And we have energy coming through our hands for good when we learn to acquire for the whole rather than the part. And okay, any more comment on that before we move on to the next point? The third, he says, the hands are wielders of the sword. We talked a little bit about this last time. The sword is a symbol of many things. The two-edged sword, also called the sword of cold blue steel by the hierarchy, he says that it separates the real from the unreal. And this is kind of the use of the sword in the scriptures. It talks about the word of God as a two-edged sword that separates soul and spirit and matter and all this. And so this is a symbol of the sword. The sharp two-edged sword separates the real from the unreal, and the mind is a little bit like a sword that can do this separation. Also, we have what he calls the sword of renunciation, or that double-bladed axe, which the disciple willingly applies to anything he considers likely to hold him back from his goal. It is applied primarily to the things of the physical plane. Okay, so we have to have use a sword to remove the obstacles that prevent us from a progression. A little bit like going through a jungle and having to clear the jungle before you can move forward as you're progressing through all that foliage. The disciple has to use this sword as a double-bladed axe to remove the obstacles in his way. And
the symbol of Shakespeare, I've always thought that we shake the spear of truth in the face of ignorance.
I never heard it put that way. That's interesting. I wonder if that was how the name was chosen.
Well, I think Francis Bacon used that term to secretly show his intent.
Yeah, could have done. Who knows? Okay, so yeah, we have to. Oftentimes, a disciple feels like he's kind of wading through honey, or molasses. That's progress is really hard, and this is where this principle, the double-bladed axe, comes in. When the disciple reaches that point to where he feels he's not progressing, you have to use the power will, produce that double-bladed axe sword, and plow your way forward, and then you'll have a light at the end of the tunnel where things get easier. And the third thing he points out is the sword of the Spirit is that weapon in the hands of the disciple. It cuts down before the eyes of the group he is serving the obstacles which stand in the way of group progress. Okay, so we use that double-bladed axe to get things out of the way of the individual. Then we also have to use the sword to assist the group we're in to clear the way so that the group can make progress. A little bit like Rick did. If Rick feels the progress isn't going the way he thinks, so he brings out a sword and starts swinging it a little bit. If nothing, whether Rick is right or wrong, at least he stirs us up and makes us think about how we can progress a little better. So all's good in the end.
And we have to see that that's what's happening in our political scene and throughout the world right now, is things have to be stirred up.
Oh yeah, we got a whole bunch of axes being swung around in the political world. That's certainly true. Then he quotes old commentary. I always love the old commentary because it has such a deep meaning. He says, "The steel is needed for the transmission of the fire. When the force of the inner man is coupled with energy transmitted through the chakras of the palms, it passes down the shining blade and blendeth with the force of the one who is the all. Thus is the plan consummated." Heavy duty words. So the steel is needed for the transmission of fire. So yeah, the steel is the pure word of truth, so to speak, and the truth transmits the fire of the spirit or the soul, so it gets moved to where it needs to be moved to and registered where it needs to be registered.
Like a lightsaber.
Yeah. So the symbology is very interesting. He says eventually, as mankind progresses and the end of our evolution, we will transmit by mental telepathy to each other in symbols and not even use words as we understand them today, which would be interesting. He says, "Thus is the energy the one augmented by the whole." Now, the fourth use of the hands, and remember these are sequential, so when we reach this point to where we can use the sword of the spirit to remove obstacles, then we move to the fourth point where all initiates are healers and use their palms to transmit energy. So then you will then have greater power to heal and transmit energy. Now, healing is not only physical, but it's also spiritual. You'll notice that there are certain people that you meet in your life that when they enter into your aura, it just cheers you up. And it's hard to be depressed around certain people because they just have a certain aura about them that just lifts you up. Then there's others that just do the opposite, and you want to avoid these people because they're like, if you're sufficient on your have good energy flow, you can endure being around negative people, but even that is not necessarily pleasant. You'll gravitate to the people that lift you up. And but we want to be, each one of us want to be one of those people that when you enter a room, the lightness, everything becomes a little lighter, and everybody becomes a little bit more cheerful when you enter the room. That's what you want to aspire to as a disciple. So are we the type of people that when we enter a room or enter the aura of another person, they feel just a little bit lighter and more in tune with soul and spirit? That's interesting. I'm sure Jesus had that effect on everybody he entertained, except those that were dark and saw him as the enemy. Then what it did, it reflected their own negativity right back to them. So that was interesting. So he had people either just swarming to him, wanting to be in his presence and receiving what he had, or people that reflected their own darkness and saw him as a tremendous threat. So, yeah, that is, yeah. What's say, Curtis?
I say that's why he was called a sword.
Yeah.
He was referred to as a sword of truth because he did that very thing.
Exactly.
He would divide people.
Yeah, he cut apart soul, body, and spirit, so to speak. So he he divided the people into those that moved towards spirit and those that were moving away from spirit.
Right.
And the people were on two sides. He appears as a sword, and he cut asunder those who wanted to get closer to spirit and those who were moving away from spirit. So that's an interesting point.
Well, I'd like to say if we don't have that presence, we got a lot of work to do. If we're not one of those people.
Yeah, we want to be definitely one of those people. And also, I might point out that sometimes, sometimes the best of us have a lot of stuff happen in our life we have to handle, and our attention is taken away. So sometimes when we as individuals in our room, we are more elevating than other times. So what we want to do is keep our minds focused on the light at all times so that we can be consistently in the spirit. And this is a difficult accomplishment for a disciple to achieve, is to be steady in the light at all times. So you never are seen as a negative force by your associates. You're always seen as a positive force. And
Well, I think that's when you take the sword and then you start simplifying your life, because what most people do doesn't matter at all. What they think matters does not.
exactly. Okay.
It helps if you walk in a room. It helps light up the room if you smile as you walk in.
Yeah, a smile is really a good key. And, this is another thing a lot of teachers have taught, is that, energy follows thought. If you put thought in a smile or just looking cheerful, then even if you don't feel cheerful, you'll start to feel better. Just because if your actions are positive, your thought begins to follow. So if you're not feeling very positive, do something positive, look positive, and you'll start to feel more positive. He explains in other writings that this force is the force of will that must be strongly exerted to rent the veils between spirit and matter to bring down the healing energy. Conscious use of healing forces often comes from a link with an adept on the other side, but sincere seekers can generate some healing power themselves. But because of lack of knowledge, they can also do more harm than good if they don't understand and focus completely on higher will when they bring down some of these powers. So sometimes we as individuals are actually linked up with an adept on the other side, but are completely unaware of it. Does anybody here feel they get impressions from some invisible entity that's kind of watching over them? You ever feel that? Rick feels that. Okay.
I've had that feeling, and I know that I've been protected and kept from harm's way in many situations. And I feel inspiration comes when I'm open to it.
Yeah, we probably have a lot more going on in the invisible world in connection with us and our soul than we could imagine. Now, the next point is in using the hands or turning the keys, and we'll continue on this next week. Is there any more comments or questions on what we have discussed before we move on, or before we close out today?
Each one of us has someone in spirit that's interested in our well-being. And when we seek to grow spiritually, we attract those who have the ability to aid us.
Yeah, that's
yeah, and
true.
on the same turn, each one of us has someone in our circle of influence that needs our energy, that we can send energy to. That's the service part.
Yeah, and like say, Jill is in the hospital at this time, so for this next week, in your quiet moments, focus on her, send her healing energy.
What's her last name?
Le Pen, I think. What's her last name, Stacy?
Last name, her last